tell us about yourself, whatever you want to say, and then where you are now, and then how do you see 2021 or 2022?
From a PPD perspective or from in general?
General, about you, because you are one of the top expert in PPD, in delivery, whatever,
Yeah, that was fun. Yeah. As you know, we've known each other since 2002 and have worked on public-private dialogue. Since then, since that time, when I was managing the government, the Cambodian Government Private Sector Forum, I've been working on PPDs in over 20 countries, often in fragile and conflict-affected states, and on a range of different ways, from total national PPDs such as the Ethiopia Public-Private Consultative Forum, to small sector issue-focused forums like a women's agriculture PPD in Afghanistan. So the issue with PPD that I've found over these years is that it is a concept, and it can be applied across a whole range of different issues of varying complexity. But at the end of the day, I've always found it is about people. Public-private dialogue is about connecting people together and helping them work together to achieve outcomes. So that's something that I've done and have enjoyed doing. And what we found in the last year or so, that's been very different because we've had to do it online. But the most consistent, situation, regardless of this, is that people are still asking, we accept PPD, how do we do it? So that is the most consistent issue that online or in person, it's still the number one question that's asked once the concept is delivered. And
so start with so the first PPD conference was 2005, and then since then things have moved a lot. So what do you see now, 2021? How the PPD has evolved?
Well, the principles of PPD are so well understood now. When you go into a country, or when I get asked to give some input on PPD, whether that's from the conceptual phase or the review phase or the management phase, whatever it might be, I never have to worry about the concept being understood because it's so well understood, and donors promote it. So many different donors promote PPD, GIZ, EBRD, World Bank, the whole range of them. So that's not an issue. The issue is that after so many years, you can go to a country and different institutions have PPD. Yeah. And so there's an element, what then comes up is an element of territorialism around PPD. Who's actually doing it? I was here first. No, is there room for more than one? It's public-private dialogue, of course, there's space for everyone. The issue remains of how do you get a result for PPD? And what is a result for PPD? And that is still the fundamental issue, because you can have in one country, you can have a number of PPDs, but the private sector still saying exactly what they might have said 10, 15 years ago, which is we're not being heard, we're not getting a place at the table, we go to the meetings and it's all one-sided. So that can still, the big difference is not delivering the concept anymore, it's going back to the well and making sure that the structures that are in place are actually delivering for who they should be delivering to. One of the things, that sort of drives that idea of about where interventions are is actually reframing what public-private dialogue is. So if you extended public-private dialogue as an acronym to public-private dialogue for outcomes, rather than ending a public-private dialogue, then people would say, well, what are the outcomes? How do you get to the outcomes? Rather than how do you get to the dialogue? And so, in the Cambodian sense, it was like, you're able to work on their, broad shoulders, in the sense that we've been working there intensely for 6 years, and there was such a solid platform where you could, legitimately ask these questions about how is this institutionalized process sustainable, and what do we need to help with that sustainability to maintain that process. And so and that's off the basis of that substantive bit of work that went over, that was very in-depth and over a long period of time. Now we have the capability to go into a country and say, what sort of dialogue do you need? Is it tactical? Is it strategic? Do you want a short-term dialogue or a long-term sustainable dialogue? Do you want just short-term quick wins? That may be the best thing for you today. And so, and then in the third branch, that's at the concept, that's at the early phase, but that third branch of PPD now, which says, we're not so worried in the tactical or the strategic dialogues that are going to need different tools and different institutional support. We can now look at a whole bunch of, if you've got 2 or 3 PPDs happening, how do we provide the government with time and space to manage what's coming out of PPD? Maybe we need to provide that sort of high-level managerial advice to the government, so they can actually manage what's coming up. In the past, a big issue from governments has been, don't worry about us, the private sector can't organise themselves, help them, and we're fine. So this idea of structurally, you've accepted it through the investment council, you've accepted it through the cabinet, you've accepted it maybe even through a parliamentary committee, but you're not managing the dialogue. So how can we make that, even though your intent is there, how can we make that more efficient? And from the private sector side, it's remarkably familiar, the idea of support to secretariat functions, support to, at an institutional level, research, position papers. It's remarkably, the capacity issues there still seem very consistent.
Yeah, so you work with Tony Blair Delivery Associates, right?
Yeah.
Which is all about outcomes and getting things done. So have you applied, this delivery approach to then the PPD that you're supporting?
So I worked with Tony Blair in one, but I also worked with Sir Michael Barber in Delivery Associates, which was a separate company. So but obviously Sir Michael was Tony Blair's delivery specialist, and he introduced this idea of deliverology. And look, I just thought it was, in particular, working with Delivery Associates was really interesting, because PPD, we wanted to get to the outcomes, or we want to get to the outcomes, and we provide, PPD is very holistic. It's an entire mechanism that takes into account, government, private sector, internal political, social dynamics, a whole range of different things. That's why it's so complete, and I think that's why it's largely struggled with, because it requires so many moving pieces. Delivery Associates with deliverology concept goes straight to the end. What do you want to deliver at the end? Like, give us specifically what in that sector, in that problem, in that issue. So I think that they fit together very, very well. The difference being that if you have one specific thing that you want to deliver, you can work back through the PPD concept. Okay, you want to deliver that? This is what you need to do, the entire process to get to that point and deliver on that. Deliverology, the concept can go very quickly to, this is specifically what you want, then, and focuses just on that end outcome until it's delivered. But you can work backwards from that, from a PPD perspective, and say, okay, one issue that we worked with Delivery Associates was they're very politically demanding, technically quite difficult, and you needed a process to deliver it. And so the PPD process, that's where it comes in and combines with it very, very well. So where PPD probably is the sort of where the departure point on deliverology and PPD is PPD, as you know, as certainly you and I know, it is taking all the stakeholders along to get to that outcome.
I mean, let's step back, right? Because if you look at the case of Cambodia again, you know, you are at the end of the war, and you really need sometimes just a public-private dialogue to create trust, to rebuild the relationship with people. And I think that at least for the Cambodia Government Private Sector Forum and in other countries, it's really about having this holding environment. And it took so much time to do that, to arrive at that level of trust where the two sides could talk to each other. And I remember, I couldn't remember if it was Suk Chanda or someone else saying, you know, or Champrasit Minister of Commerce, we were coming to the GPSF as if we were going with a Kalashnikov. We were not sure what these guys are going to say and how we are going to react. Remember that? Because you were the coordinator there.
Yeah. It was strong. So it's always that was a very delicate period, and it was very hard on everyone involved. No doubt about that. It was very taxing, you know, mentally, you know, from a psychological perspective, coming out of the war, entering engagement with the counterparts who, you know, were all players in Cambodia at that time, and it was fraught. Now, one of the interesting things about that, it's something that I've taken with me, whether I've gone to, you know, Afghanistan or Rwanda or wherever it might be, countries coming out of conflict, in one way or another, or over periods of time. The residual issues of conflict are so strong, and they remain for such long periods of time. A lot of, you know, I remember working in Afghanistan back in 2011 to 13 and reading reports from donors talking about post-conflict Afghanistan, you know, when bombs are going off outside and literally many people dying, and thinking we've really got to understand, we can't talk about progress until we can start understanding the conflict that we're trying to address, and the issue of and what conflict does is it's awful on personal relationships, trust between, you know, really damages people's perceptions of each other and what they're meant to do, what roles they're meant to play coming out of conflict. It's all convoluted, as it was in Cambodia. So firstly, understanding, particularly when you're applying resources, that we're looking at issues that can't easily be measured by standard indicators. It's all really the bench line, or the baseline for it is meant to be, should be, we've got hard indicators we need to get to because we're about getting results, but to get there, we have to move on a whole range of non-standard indicators that are often relationship-based and can be. Before we started, no one would sit in a room with each other, and sometime in, people are working with each other on a range of different issues to, you know, the end result being there's a constant process of dialogue between a number of partners who are getting outcomes. So I think that measurement framework is really important. In Ethiopia, I worked on Ethiopia to establish the Ethiopia Public-Private Consultative Forum. It took 6 years, which was a record for the IFC, I think, World Bank Group at the time. But they gave a lot of time and space for it because Ethiopia was seen as that difficult. And in that space, in that time, it wasn't a lot of discussion. It was a lot of reorganization. Like, to get to the Public-Private Consultative Forum, the Chamber of Commerce constitution had to be changed. The government had to be willing to enter the dialogue, and the private sector had to be willing to say, to get to for the government to come to the dialogue, we have to provide more veracity around our membership base and how that membership base is registered, and how transparent it is, and a whole range of different issues. So there was yes, we're after a public-private dialogue, but in the context of Ethiopia back in 2005 to say 2012, it was actually building up the structure and the platform to get the dialogue to happen. And then it happened, and it was very successful for, for a number of years. So, but the first principle was, what is actually the relationship between the partners? And if it's so brittle and so affected by conflict, then we really need to be sensitive to that and address it. A lot of people say, well, that's a lot of time on social discourse, but it's so worth it because the results in Cambodia and Ethiopia were amazing.
So in terms of 20-year span, right? It started in 2001 when you were there to 2021. You should celebrate that, right? Because it's probably one of the longest living public-private dialogue.
Well, that's great. I actually it started in 2001, as you say. It didn't really, I got there in 2002, and I think we had the first government private sector forum meeting in June or May, June 2002. And but it had a long gestation period. And I got there like January 2002 and worked to get the first one going. But like, so we have to accept, I think, that there's real depth is required to build sustainability, and you can't, and I've been involved, I don't know how many PPDs I've worked on, maybe 20 or maybe more in different formats, probably more, and international conferences and all sorts of things with PPD, and I have to say the most consistent thing that I think happens is people buy into the concept, whether it's a PPD on SEZs or whether it's a national PPD made in covering all different levels of government. People rarely give it enough time and space in terms of resourcing it to build that sustainability. It's often, I've been involved in PPDs that are very demanding, very technically difficult, requiring a lot of work to get partners together, colleagues together from government, private sector, donors, civil society, and then it's left far too early. It's left to run far too early by itself without the depth that it's required to get where it needs to go, which is outcomes. And everyone along the journey will say, this is great, it's really important, we need it, and then not give it the time to survive. Or donors, can be very, they often get the product and then become very insular with it. Like they'll hold it to themselves. We've got it and keep it to themselves, and that doesn't help sustainability. And so I think the understanding what we did in Cambodia, what you and I, and together with our colleagues at the World Bank Group and all those other people who were involved in it, what it took to get it working was a lot of time and resources, but the benefit for it was I think, a lot of PPD work, people don't, when they do the cost benefit analysis, they almost don't believe it. That this could be is so.
Yeah, I had a question last week about the Cameroon Business Forum. I don't know if you were involved. And so there's a new program officer working on it, and asked Benjamin and myself, do you think the CBF was successful? Because like the Cambodian Forum, we were in there for 10 years, I think.
Oh wow! Right.
Question, and what I answered to him is that look at the impact. If they have only done one regulation, just one over the 10 years, but then the impact was so big on the business environment, on the easiness of for the private sector to do work, to invest, to hire people, then it's successful. Whether it's 10 years or 15 years, but if really over that time they have been able to achieve some of the reforms, I think that's it. It speaks by itself.
Yeah, I agree, but I would add to that and say that you know, PPD requires a professional team as the secretariat, government, private sector, requires that level of responsiveness between each other, but also to all the stakeholders. But also the idea of PPD, as it is private sector oriented or economic growth oriented, that there are so many resources available to it if people involved in it were creative enough to understand where it can be from. So, you know, being involved in PPD and making it sustainable, if the people involved in it are actually open and understand that we can get, well, not only we can get the resources, we actually need a whole range of different inputs. PPD can be, you know, much more successful. It should be, people involved in it should be very much conscious of the importance of partnerships, whatever they may be, to supporting PPD over longer periods of time, unless they have a very fixed idea of like a deliverology, getting, you know, one thing done quickly. But it's often neglected. I think the partnerships, whether chambers of commerce from Germany or a guild from Italy, or partners in you know, in Rwanda, customs reform, whatever it might be, there's a lot of people out there who are willing to participate and provide resources if people involved in it are open enough to get them.
So looking at the experience you have with all the, you know, interventions you have supported, what would be, maybe that's too hard to ask, you know, some key lessons you can share? And we can structure it, you know, at the beginning, you know, when you started, when it's developed enough, and then you're on cruise, how you say that, control, when the process is stalled. For example, you have elections coming and then there is no government for a couple of months or years. So what do you do? And then when you exit. So if you look at 4 or 5 phases, what would be the key lessons, or the key lessons overall? Up to you.
Well, I think that you know, when the PPD handbook went out back in 2005, and I'd written something in that and contributed with Benjamin, and he'd asked a similar question about, you know, what's the key ingredient, and it's the same. It's like hard work. It's really hard work. PPD is really hard work. There's nothing. It's almost physical to get to those major forums and working groups. It's a physical effort to get there. So there's no, people shouldn't go into PPD misunderstanding the level of commitment that's required, which to me means it's a huge opportunity when you're doing PPD, because if you're doing it well, structuring it well, you can actually introduce into an economy a world standard secretariat process that can instill into the community, you know, lessons like minutes preparation or meeting preparation or agenda development, a position and paper analysis, use of evidence, all of those kind of things, relationships with government, how to manage all that. So hard work is the number one issue. And from the beginning, it is, you know, I think one of the, and I learned everything I learned, I was, you know, is based on feedback I get from the people I work with. So the people I learned from were the people I worked with, and I'm just a sounding board for their needs so that I could deliver to their needs, so that they could get, you know, government, private sector, civil society, the community could get what it wanted. So at the beginning, it's really making sure stakeholders can see each other's viewpoint. So often it means putting things on paper that reflect the opinion of the whole community, so they can see whether it's issues between the government and private sector, within the private sector, or the challenges they're facing within across the economy or in sectors, that they can see it and say, okay, we share, we understand, and we can see. So that is an element of confidence building from the beginning, to say, this is, I'm impartial, this is what I've heard, and this is, you know, this is a platform from where we can work from. I find people are very happy to see that very basic level of interaction. So when the process moves forward and it's going along, it's really important to be flexible with PPD. You shouldn't make it stale. I think I used to have this conversation with His Excellency in Cambodia quite frequently, at least once a year, where we'd say, what can we do now? What should be different? How do we make it? How can we, you know, improve on this process that after a few years was sort of working along quite well? And so, so I think those conversations around flexibility, often we just say, well, we could see something that needed to be done, but we'd say, look, it's working like it is. That's given the circumstances that we're in Cambodia at that time. Let's just keep on going. But we, you know, there were other things that we could look at. And then that comes into the whole idea at some point when you've got the process working, when you've got the government and private sector meeting and you're getting good results and everyone's happy with that, government and private sector are saying we've got a relationship. There is an element of strategy involved where you can say, okay, the process is working. How do we expand this? Or how do we make the product better? Or are we reaching the communities that we need to reach? And so the idea, whether it was expanding working groups, we had an industrial relations working group came on board, going into the SME sector, making sure women or youth groups were involved, providing the platforms, reaching out into the provinces, making sure that the provinces were engaged or having public-private dialogue out in the provinces. So when the process is going along swimmingly, looking at ways to build on it and, you know, sort of get the institutional framework really embedded within the community. And then on the exit, you know, you were the master of the exit, but it's a really difficult thing exiting because you want it to be as sustainable as possible. And so the idea on exiting is making sure all along the road that you're able to leave, that you're able to get out, that you're leaving a footprint that can be followed. And so I was in Sudan, I can, you know, say there's a couple of years now working on a PSD program for the UNDP. And I'd been there back in 2005-06 for a few years, working on delivering public-private dialogue in Khartoum and in Juba, two different ones. And obviously the political situation in northern Sudan had been very difficult until the government changed just shortly after I left a couple of years ago. But when I went into the Chamber of Commerce in North Sudan, in Khartoum, they hadn't been able to progress on PPD, but on their wall, all around the wall, was the process that we designed back in 2006 or 7. They were ready to move with it. So the idea so there was the footprint on the wall. So the idea that exiting, whether you're fully institutionalized like Cambodia and then hand it off to Lily, or whether it's what can we do to this stage? What makes this work now so that everyone's on the same page? We've moved the agenda forward, but that we can come back to it at some point if needs be and help it move that, you know, get forward, progress again, you know, take it up and make it move forward. So I think the idea of, you know, even at the point of exit, understanding that PPD is inherently fragile, but you need, if it's possible, make sure you leave a footprint that you can come back and build on it, build on it again, because PPD is all about people. And if you don't have the right, you can run the best PPD in the world, but if the next people come in and have no interest in it, then it sort of falls apart. But if you've left a good enough institutional footprint, then you can pick it up again, because people are in the market, private sector or government, whether it's government, it doesn't even have to be executive government, but it can be the bureaucracy within government. When they know the process, they can pick it up again. So I think before you exit, making sure you get to that point, it's important.
So here it's important to say that here we're operating in fragile context, right? So then the donor, like the bank or the IFC, will come and there were some kind of needs assessment that a dialogue needs to take place. It doesn't exist. We come in and then we help set up the secretariat. Usually it's staffed by people from the bank or from the donor institution. It can be consultants hired by the donors to run this. The other options would be that the secretariat is in a government institution, can be at the Chamber, Ministry of Commerce or the investment board, or it can be in the private sector, the Chamber of Commerce. This has not happened in the early PPDs that the bank or the IFC has supported. So that's why we're talking about exiting, because we were there to do that bridge. But then, you know, at one point we have to leave so that the dialogue is taking place directly between the private sector and the government without the intervention of a donor organization. So in that context, what would be the qualities, you know, of a neutral facilitator? I would say that, you know, someone who can run the secretariat. So from your experience.
Look, firstly, from the secretariat perspective, the idea of professionalism and neutrality. So to build trust between the government and private sector, they want to see professionalism. They want to know, firstly, they're speaking to someone in confidence at all times, and that confidence preserved. That person's not, or that team is not grandstanding, putting themselves forward rather than the government and private sector. That the issues are getting to the table, not being prescribed to by an outside organisation or one organisation, or by that secretariat themselves. They want to see that what they want to discuss is being discussed, and then the issues that are going back out are actually being communicated. One of the big problems of PPD, good, well run, indifferently run, is that communication is often very poorly done. It's one of the worst aspects of PPD. Many secretariats, many people, government, private sector, are bad at communicating with their stakeholders. So that the idea of that neutral secretariat being able to stand back, let people engage, intervene when required to provide whatever tool or analysis or evidence is required, and then gather the information and make sure that all stakeholders, government and private sector, have it and are completely in agreement with what's coming out. You know, so they're issues of high professional standards. But what I would say also on the issue of sustainability, just going back a moment ago, is that the design phase of any intervention from the World Bank Group or from any other donor should be very clear that they are not the only stakeholder in the room that can manage PPD going forward. So the World Bank may be excellent and is excellent at getting at that, you know, especially in FCS, getting people together, getting in the first in, we need this, let's get people together. They're not great at saying, we want to be there for 10 years. They don't want to do that. And I think they're very upfront about that. And so, but there are other donors who are very happy to come in and take bits of the pie, provide a full-time staff member, provide equipment, to take up aspects of it over time, to work on a particular sector. So I think you've got to be really open, much more open than perhaps, you know, many donors have been in the past through institutional reasons, more than anything, and saying we need a community of stakeholders to make this last over a period of time. They can be donors, they can be utilize different parts of donor resources. They can also be private sector, which may be civil society organisations from other countries. So I think they need, sustainability doesn't depend so much on the good work you've done from year one to year X when you finish. It should be based on the partnerships you've made so that your exit as an institution is a lot smoother without having to say, well, that's it for us. Good luck. Hope you can do this by yourself. Because in a lot of countries, the interventions from development partners are because, unfortunately, there are issues within those countries that otherwise preclude people coming together. So there is a legitimate role for that development partner to come in.
Yeah.
No one in government or private sector likes or wants donors to come into their business. Advocacy for the private sector is their business. You know, they don't necessarily like it, but they acknowledge that they need it, and so they accept it whilst it's there. And sometimes that bridge just needs to last a bit longer, and that shouldn't be seen as a negative. You know, there are big private sector firms that have high-level consultancies embedded with them for years, advising them on strategy and implementation, a whole range of things. So there shouldn't be an all or nothing sort of
trust. I think really the elements is really building trust, especially in fragile contexts.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And that there is a case to be made for donors to invest in establishing that dialogue platform just for dialogue. And but at the same time, we're so inflexible about doing a project without having measurable output or outcome or impact. But really from the experience you have and that I have, it's really that we need that space to build the dialogue for a neutral facilitator to come in, because as you say, the private sector already had lots of expertise. They have lots of money. They work with consulting firms, but they don't have that bridge to talk to the government and for government people to talk to the private sector. And that is really so much needed in fragile context.
So, as we go forward in 21, the end of 2021 and 2022, I think the demand for public-private dialogue won't go away, but the addressing the how to make it work actually can be enhanced by what you're doing. So enhanced by utilizing the communication means that we've now had to become very familiar with, and rather than have this sort of what's often a sort of the random ability for people to connect for expertise, having it centralized in a way, or having a platform that people can dialogue, use to dialogue quite frequently and address those how-to issues that range from how do we deliver the whole product of PPD, the whole mechanism, to how do we manage this particular issue. I think this could be a very, very useful thing for public-private dialogue. Yeah.
We have to work on this together, James.
Yes, I'm here.
Let's make it an objective.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.